The Xanthari Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and their ships were everywhere, and their weapons could destroy entire worlds, and they thought no one could stop them. They had conquered hundreds of planets and enslaved thousands of species, and they never asked permission, and they never showed mercy. When their scouts found Earth in 2247, they saw just another primitive world full of weak creatures who would die easily. The Xanthari Council met for less than an hour before they made their decision, and the decision was simple. Burn it all. Commander Jake Morrison stood on Lunar Station 7 watching through the massive windows as the Xanthari fleet arrived. There were 50 massive ships, each one bigger than anything humanity had ever built, and they moved through space like predators. Jake had been ordered to evacuate with the other personnel, but he could not move, because his wife Lisa and his daughter Emma were in Chicago, and the communications had stopped working an hour ago. He pressed his hand against the cold glass and watched the first ship enter. Earth's atmosphere, and then the sky started burning. The bombardment began at 0800 hours Greenwich Mean Time. The Xanthari did not send demands, and they did not give warnings, and they did not care about surrender. They simply fired their plasma cannons at every major city on the planet. New York vanished in a pillar of white fire that reached into space. London became a crater of melted stone. Tokyo, Beijing, Mumbai, São Paulo, one by one they disappeared. Jake watched the feeds from the surface cameras until each one went dark. He saw people running, and then he saw nothing but fire. His hands shook and his breath fogged the glass, and somewhere down there his family was dying. Captain Nicole Barnes commanded the CSS Defiant, one of Earth's 12 deep space warships. She had been on patrol near Jupiter when the distress signals started flooding in. Her communications officer, a young man named Greg Hamilton, played the messages on the bridge speakers. They heard screaming, and they heard explosions, and they heard the sound of the world ending. Nicole's knuckles turned white as she gripped her command chair. Her parents lived in Seattle, and her brother worked in Geneva, and she had 2 nephews who were probably in school when the burning started. Greg looked at her with desperate eyes and asked if they should return to Earth. Nicole wanted to say yes, and she wanted to order full speed ahead, and she wanted to die fighting if that was what it took. But she was a captain, and she had a crew of 200 people, and she knew that one small warship could not stop 50 Xanthari dreadnoughts. She opened her mouth to give the order anyway, because logic meant nothing when your world was burning. Then the priority transmission came through on all channels, and Admiral Patricia Cole's face appeared on every screen. The Admiral's uniform was torn, and her face was covered in ash and blood, and behind her buildings were collapsing. She spoke quickly because she did not have much time. She told all surviving Earth forces not to return to Sol, and she said the Xanthari had deployed atmospheric processors that would make Earth uninhabitable within 48 hours. She said approximately 400 million humans had survived in the colonies and space stations and on the moon. She said they were all that remained of humanity. Her voice cracked when she said the number of dead, nearly 8 billion people gone in less than a day. Then she gave her final order, and her voice became hard as steel. Fall back to Sanctuary Point and regroup and survive, and then make the Xanthari pay for every single life they took. The transmission ended, and the bridge of the Defiant was silent except for the sound of people crying. Jake Morrison evacuated on the last transport from Lunar Station 7. He sat by the window as they accelerated away from Earth, and he watched his home world become smaller and smaller. The planet was no longer blue and green, but red and black and covered in smoke. Massive storms were forming where the oceans had been superheated. Lightning flashed across continents that no longer had any cities. 5 billion people dead on the surface, and 3 billion more would die when the atmosphere burned away completely. His wife was down there, and his daughter was down there, and he would never see them again. He would never hold them again, and he would never hear their voices again. Something broke inside Jake Morrison that day, and what grew in its place was cold and patient and absolutely without mercy. The transport ship was crowded with survivors, and everyone was crying or staring blankly at nothing. Some people were injured, and some were in shock, and all of them were refugees now. They had left Earth with nothing but the clothes on their backs. A woman near Jake kept repeating her son's name over and over. An old man held a photograph of his family, and tears ran down his face. Jake looked at them all, and he made a promise to himself and to the dead. The Xanthari thought they had destroyed humanity, and they thought this was the end. They were wrong, and Jake would spend the rest of his life proving them wrong. He would learn everything about the Xanthari, and he would find their weaknesses and he would make them understand what they had done. He would make them pay in blood and fire and fear. The transport jumped to faster than light speed and Earth disappeared behind them. In the cargo hold, someone had started singing an old song about home, and soon others joined in. Their voices were broken and sad, but they sang anyway because singing meant they were still alive. Jake did not sing and he did not cry anymore. He sat in silence and watched the stars and planned. The Xanthari had taken everything from humanity, and they thought that made them strong. But they had made a mistake, and the mistake was leaving survivors. 400 million survivors scattered across the colonies, and every single one of them would remember this day. Every single one of them would carry the weight of 8 billion dead. The Xanthari had created something they did not understand, and they would not understand it until it was too late. They had created an enemy that would never stop and never forgive and never show mercy. They had burned humanity's home, and now humanity would burn their empire to ashes. Sanctuary Point was an old mining outpost in the Kepler belt that nobody had used for 20 years. It was far from any major trade routes and hidden behind an asteroid field, and the Xanthari did not know it existed. Admiral Patricia Cole had chosen it carefully because humanity needed a place to hide and heal and grow strong again. The 400 million survivors came in scattered groups over several months. They brought whatever ships they could salvage and whatever supplies they could carry, and all of them brought their grief and rage. The outpost was designed for maybe 10,000 people, but they made it work because they had no choice. They expanded the habitats and built new structures and turned the empty tunnels into factories and training facilities. Nicole Barnes was promoted to Admiral 6 months after the burning. She was only 32 years old, but age did not matter anymore because most of the senior officers had died on Earth. She stood in the command center of Sanctuary Point and looked at the holographic display showing their pathetic fleet. 12 warships, 40 cargo vessels, maybe 200 smaller craft. The Xanthari Empire had tens of thousands of warships and controlled 200 star systems. The math was impossible, but Nicole had stopped caring about impossible. She gathered her best engineers and scientists and officers and told them they had one job: find a way to kill Xanthari that did not require matching them ship for ship. Kyle Patterson was a propulsion engineer who had been working on experimental drives before the burning. He was a quiet man with messy hair, and he had not spoken about his family, and nobody asked because everyone had lost someone. He worked 18 hours a day in the research labs, and 3 months later he called Admiral Barnes with something he called the Phantom Drive. Nicole came to his lab and found him standing next to a small engine that hummed softly. Kyle explained that normal drives produced massive energy signatures that could be detected from light years away, but his drive worked differently. It bent space in a way that left almost no trace, and ships using it could move through enemy territory without being seen. Nicole touched the engine carefully and asked if it really worked. Kyle nodded and said he had tested it on a small drone, and it had flown right past Xanthari patrol routes without being detected. Nicole smiled for the first time in months. She told Kyle to start installing these drives on every ship they had, because if they could not fight the Xanthari in open battle, then they would fight from the shadows. They would become ghosts that struck without warning and disappeared before the enemy could respond. The Xanthari would learn to fear the dark. Dr. Helen Cruz ran the weapons development program. She had been a physicist before the war, and now she designed ways to kill. Her husband and 2 sons had died in Mexico City, and she never smiled anymore, and her eyes were always cold. She worked with a team of 30 scientists in a sealed lab deep inside the asteroid. They tested new weapons every day, and most of them failed, but Helen never stopped trying. 6 months into the program, she invited Admiral Barnes to see something new. Nicole entered the lab and saw a torpedo that looked normal, except it glowed with a faint blue light. Helen explained that Xanthari shields could withstand nuclear explosions because they generated incredible amounts of energy to deflect incoming attacks. She said every weapon humanity had tried to develop focused on breaking through those shields with more power. But Helen had taken a different approach. Her Cascade torpedo did not try to break the shield, but instead fed on the shield's own energy. Once it made contact with a Xanthari vessel, it created a feedback loop that turned the shield against the ship itself. The more energy the shield generated, the more the torpedo consumed. Within seconds, the shield would collapse inward and tear the ship apart from the inside. Nicole watched a simulation of the weapon in action, and she watched a Xanthari dreadnought crush itself like a tin can. She told Helen to build as many of these as possible. Jake Morrison had become someone different after the burning. The quiet man who had loved his family was gone, and what remained was a weapon shaped like a human. He volunteered to lead the Special Forces program, and Admiral Barnes gave him complete authority. Jake called it Phantom Corps, and he recruited the most dangerous survivors he could find. These were people who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose and wanted only revenge. He trained them in a huge cavern carved from the asteroid, and the training was brutal. They learned to fight in zero gravity, and they learned to breach ships, and they learned to kill Xanthari in 100 different ways. Jake taught them that the Xanthari saw humans as insects, and he said that was good because insects were hard to kill and insects could get into everything. And enough insects could bring down giants, Lieutenant. Amy Foster was one of Jake's best soldiers. She had been a botanist before the war, living on Mars with her girlfriend. They had been planning to get married. Amy's girlfriend had gone to Earth for the ceremony preparations. Amy did not talk about it, and nobody asked, but everyone knew why she fought with such fury during training. She could breach a ship hull in under 30 seconds, and she could disable a Xanthari soldier with her bare hands. Jake watched her train, and he saw himself in her eyes, cold and focused and absolutely committed to making the enemy pay. Meanwhile, a man named Charles Wright was doing something different. Before the burning, he had been a diplomat working with the United Nations, and now he was reaching out to other species in secret. He traveled on unmarked ships to distant worlds, and he spoke to representatives from species that the Xanthari had conquered or threatened. The Draknir had been enslaved for 200 years. The Salian Collective had lost 3 colonies to Xanthari expansion. The hive worlds of Meridian had seen their queen executed for refusing to submit. Charles told them all the same thing. Humanity was building a resistance, and when the time came, they would fight the Xanthari together. Many species were afraid to join because the Xanthari were too powerful and rebellion meant death. But Charles was patient, and he showed them footage of what the Xanthari had done to Earth. He showed them cities burning and people dying, and the entire world turned into a graveyard. He told them that humanity had been knocked down but not destroyed, and he said that together they could hurt the Xanthari in ways that one species alone never could. Slowly, carefully, he built a network of allies who were waiting for the right moment to strike. 15 years passed at Sanctuary Point, 15 years of building and training and planning. The children who survived the burning grew up hearing stories about Earth. They learned to fight before they learned to read. They were taught that humanity had been nearly destroyed, and that the Xanthari showed no mercy, and that mercy was something humanity could no longer afford. These children would become soldiers and pilots and engineers, and all of them carried the same mission: make the Xanthari Empire pay for what it had done. Admiral Barnes watched them train, and she felt old even though she was not yet 50. An entire generation was growing up with war as their only purpose, and she wondered what kind of people they would become. Then she remembered Earth burning, and she stopped wondering because it did not matter. All that mattered was survival and revenge. The Xanthari staging ground at Talos Prime was one of their most important military bases. It sat on the edge of their empire and controlled access to the outer territories, and it housed more than 50 warships at any given time. The base had defense satellites and patrol ships and sensor networks that could detect anything approaching from light years away. The Xanthari commanders considered it absolutely safe, because no enemy had ever successfully attacked a military installation this deep in their territory. They were wrong, and their arrogance would cost them everything. Jake Morrison studied the intelligence reports for 6 months before he decided Talos Prime would be humanity's first target. Admiral Barnes thought he was insane because attacking such a heavily defended base seemed like suicide. But Jake explained that the Xanthari expected enemies to attack from outside, and their defenses were built to stop fleets and missiles. They were not prepared for enemies who could slip past their sensors and attack from inside. Nicole listened to his plan and finally nodded because she trusted Jake and because humanity needed to prove they could hurt the Xanthari where it mattered most. 6 small ships left Sanctuary Point in January 2262. Each ship carried 5 soldiers from Phantom Corps, and each soldier knew they might not come back. The ships used Kyle Patterson's Phantom drives, and they moved through Xanthari space like whispers. They avoided patrol routes and hid behind asteroids and took 3 weeks to reach Talos Prime. When they arrived, they did not announce themselves, and they did not fire weapons. Instead, they drifted silently toward the Xanthari warships docked at the station. Lieutenant Amy Foster was on the lead ship, and she watched through her helmet as they approached a massive Xanthari cruiser. The ship was easily a kilometer long and covered in armor and weapons. Amy had seen ships like this in the footage from Earth's burning, and she had dreamed about destroying them for 15 years. Now she was about to make that dream real. The small transport attached itself to the cruiser's hull using magnetic clamps, and the 6 soldiers inside prepared their equipment. They would wait here, attached to the enemy ship, until Jake gave the signal. They would wait in the cold and dark with minimal life support because any energy signature might give them away. 3 days passed, and Amy floated in her suit, barely breathing. The other soldiers were silent and still. They could not move much because movement created heat, and heat could be detected. They could not talk because radio signals could be intercepted. They could only wait and trust that the Xanthari crew inside the ship had no idea they were there. Amy thought about her girlfriend, and she thought about Earth, and she thought about how the Xanthari had taken everything. The waiting was torture, but she had learned patience because revenge was worth any amount of suffering. On the 4th day, the Xanthari fleet began preparing to depart. The crews were loading supplies and running system checks and getting ready to leave for another conquest. Jake Morrison watched from his position attached to a different cruiser, and he knew this was the moment. The Xanthari were focused on departure procedures, and their attention was divided. He sent the signal using a tight beam laser that only the other Phantom Corps ships could detect. 6 teams received the message simultaneously, and they moved. Amy's team cut through the cruiser's hull using plasma torches that worked in 30 seconds. The Xanthari hull was thick, but humanity had learned to cut through anything given enough motivation. They breached into the engineering section and found themselves facing 3 Xanthari technicians, who looked up in shock. The Xanthari were tall creatures with 4 arms and scales like armor, but they died quickly when Amy's team opened fire. The soldiers moved fast through the ship's corridors, and they planted Helen Cruz's Cascade torpedoes in the shield generator room. The torpedoes were small and attached to the generators with magnetic locks and started their countdown immediately. Alarms began sounding throughout the base as other teams breached their targets. The Xanthari guards responded quickly, but they were trained to fight external threats, and they did not know how to deal with enemies already inside their ships. Jake's team encountered a squad of 10 Xanthari soldiers, and the fight was brief and brutal. The humans used weapons designed to penetrate Xanthari armor, and they fought with a ferocity that shocked their enemies. 2 Phantom Corps soldiers died, but all 10 Xanthari went down. Jake stepped over the bodies and kept moving because there was no time to mourn and no time to hesitate. The first Cascade torpedo activated on schedule. The Xanthari cruiser's shields, which were designed to protect the ship from external attacks, suddenly turned inward. The feedback loop Helen had designed worked perfectly. The shield began consuming its own energy and generating more power in a spiral that could not be stopped. The cruiser's hull started buckling, and the metal screamed as impossible forces tore it apart. The ship collapsed in on itself like a black hole had opened inside it. Crew members died instantly as the structure crushed them. Within 8 minutes, the cruiser was reduced to a twisted ball of compressed metal and burning plasma. Then the next ship exploded, and then the next. Amy's team had already extracted through an airlock and was racing away in their small transport. She looked back and watched the Xanthari fleet destroying itself. 30 warships died in less than 10 minutes. The surviving Xanthari vessels panicked and tried to flee, but some of them fired on each other, thinking they were under attack from multiple directions. The space around Telos Prime became a graveyard of burning ships and debris fields. The base itself lost structural integrity when 3 docked cruisers exploded simultaneously. The station broke apart and thousands of Xanthari personnel died in the vacuum. Jake Morrison's transport was the last one to extract. He watched the destruction through his helmet camera, and he felt nothing. No satisfaction and no joy and no remorse. He simply noted that the operation had been successful, and that humanity had proven it could hurt the Xanthari. Before his ship jumped away, he transmitted a message on all Xanthari frequencies. The message was simple and recorded in his own voice. "This is for Earth." Then they disappeared into the darkness between stars. The news of the Telos Prime attack reached the Xanthari High Command within hours. High Commander Veskara stood in the war room looking at the reports, and he could not believe what he was seeing. 30 warships destroyed, and an entire military base reduced to rubble. The attackers had been human, the species they had burned 15 years ago, the species they thought was extinct or broken. Beskara's 3 eyes burned with rage, and he ordered his commanders to find the humans and exterminate them completely. He wanted every colony tracked down and every survivor killed. The Zenthari would finish what they started, but humanity had learned to hide and they had learned to disappear. Admiral Barnes moved Sanctuary Point to a new location immediately after the attack. She scattered the population across multiple hidden bases. She made sure the Zenthari would never find them all, and then she ordered Jake Morrison to continue his campaign. Over the next 2 years, Phantom Corps conducted 27 raids across Zenthari space. Supply depots vanished overnight. Patrol fleets went missing without sending distress calls. Garrisons woke up to find their ships sabotaged beyond repair. The Zenthari began pulling their forces back from the outer territories. They concentrated their fleets around their core worlds because they did not know where the humans would strike next. High Commander Veskara sent increasingly desperate reports to the Zenthari Council, saying they were fighting an enemy they could not see and could not catch. The Council dismissed his concerns because surely the mighty Zenthari Empire could not be threatened by one defeated species. But the soldiers in the field knew better. They knew that something had changed and that the humans were not just surviving but hunting. They started calling the humans by a new name in their language, the ghosts who burn, and they were afraid. Charles Wright had spent 4 years traveling to forgotten worlds and meeting with species that the galaxy had dismissed. He spoke with rebels and refugees and anyone who hated the Zenthari Empire. The work was slow and dangerous because the Zenthari had spies everywhere, and any species caught planning rebellion would be destroyed. But Charles was patient and he never stopped believing that he could build something powerful enough to challenge the Empire. In 2264, he finally succeeded. The meeting took place at Sanctuary Point and representatives from 47 different species attended. Some came in warships and some came in cargo vessels and some came in ships so old they barely functioned. They gathered in a massive chamber carved from the asteroid, and they looked at each other with suspicion because many of their species had been enemies before. But they all shared one thing. They had all suffered under Zenthari rule. The Draknir sent their war chief, a massive creature covered in scars. The Solian Collective sent 3 ambassadors who communicated through telepathy. The Hive World sent a young queen who had been born after her mother's execution. Ambassador Lydia Grant spoke to the assembly. She had been a high school teacher on Earth, living in Boston with her husband and teaching history to teenagers. Her husband had died in the burning and her school had vanished along with her students and everything she had known. Now she stood before 47 species and carried the weight of 8 billion dead. She spoke clearly and without emotion, because emotion would make her cry and she needed to be strong. She told them that the Zenthari believed they were invincible, and that fear would keep everyone divided. She said the Zenthari had burned Earth because they thought humans were weak and insignificant. She said they were wrong. Lydia explained that humanity had spent 15 years learning to fight from nothing. They had built weapons from scraps and ships from salvage. They had learned to strike from shadows and disappear before retaliation. They had hurt the Zenthari in ways that should have been impossible. But humans were only one species with limited resources. Alone, they could only ever be a nuisance to the Empire. Together, though, with all the species the Zenthari had wronged, they could become something the Empire could not ignore. They could become a force that would break the Zenthari dominance forever. The Draknir war chief stood and spoke in a deep voice that rumbled through the chamber. He said his people had been slaves for 200 years and had forgotten what freedom felt like. He said the Zenthari had broken their warriors and destroyed their culture, and taken everything that made them strong. But the humans had shown that the Zenthari could bleed. He pulled out a curved blade and cut his own palm and let the blood drip on the floor. This was the Draknir way of making an oath. He swore that his people would fight beside humanity until the Zenthari Empire fell, or until every Draknir was dead. One by one, the other species made their pledges in their own ways. The coalition was born. Admiral Nicole Barnes was given command of the coalition's combined military forces. She stood in the new war room looking at the holographic display showing ships from dozens of species. It was not a unified fleet because each species had different technology and different tactics and different ideas about warfare, but it was more than humanity had ever hoped for. The combined forces numbered over 8,000 warships, still not enough to match the Zenthari in a straight fight, but enough to make them hurt. Nicole spent months working with the coalition commanders to develop a strategy, that used everyone's strengths. Her plan was brutal in its simplicity: attack everywhere at once. The Xanthari Empire controlled 200 star systems, and they could not defend all of them simultaneously. The coalition would force them to choose what to save and what to lose. Nicole called it Operation Wildfire because it would spread across Xanthari space like an uncontrolled blaze. She divided the coalition fleet into 70 strike groups and assigned each group a target. Some would hit military bases, and some would attack supply lines, and some would liberate conquered worlds. The attacks would happen on the same day at the same time. The Xanthari would be overwhelmed. Captain Ryan Hughes commanded one of the strike groups heading for Calera 7. Ryan had been a cargo pilot before the war, flying supplies between the colonies. He had been in deep space when Earth burned, and he had never forgiven himself for being away when his family needed him. Now he flew a coalition destroyer with a crew of humans and Draknir and Solian. The mixed crew had been difficult at first because the species barely understood each other. But they learned to work together because they had to, and because they all wanted the same thing. The Great Offensive began on March 15, 2265. 70. Coalition strike groups dropped out of hyperspace around 70 Xanthari systems simultaneously. The Xanthari defenders were caught completely off guard. They had been expecting more hit-and-run attacks from human ghosts, not full fleet engagements with thousands of ships. At Calera 7, Ryan's strike group faced 15 Xanthari warships protecting an orbital fortress. The Xanthari commander sent a transmission demanding surrender and promising that resistance would be met with total destruction. Ryan did not bother responding because there was nothing left to say. The battle was chaos and violence and desperation. The Xanthari fought with their usual discipline, but they were not prepared for the way the coalition forces coordinated. Draknir bombers would hit a target and draw fire, while human frigates would slip in from another angle and deploy cascade torpedoes. Solian fighters used their telepathic link to execute perfect formations that confused Xanthari targeting systems. Ryan watched from his bridge as a Xanthari dreadnought tried to engage 3 targets at once and failed to stop any of them. The ship's shields collapsed under combined fire, and then it broke apart. The coalition lost ships too. Ryan watched a Draknir cruiser explode when a Xanthari missile got through its defenses. He watched human fighters ram Xanthari destroyers in suicide runs when their weapons ran out. He watched Solian vessels sacrifice themselves to protect damaged allies. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it ended, the Xanthari defenders were destroyed, but the coalition had lost 20 ships. Ryan looked at the casualty reports and felt sick. They had won, but winning still meant people died. He thought about what his old flight instructor had told him years ago. There are no good days in war, only days when you survive. The news from the other 69 systems was similar. The coalition won most battles, but the victories were bloody. They took dozens of systems from Xanthari control, but the cost was thousands of ships and hundreds of thousands of lives. High Commander Viscara looked at the reports coming from across the Empire, and he finally understood that this was not a rebellion that could be crushed. This was a full-scale war against an enemy that had been preparing for years. He ordered all Xanthari forces to abandon the outer territories and fall back to the core systems. The empire that had stood for 3,000 years was contracting. Admiral Barnes watched the Xanthari withdrawal, and she knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. The Xanthari were weakened, and their forces were consolidating around their home worlds. They were trying to protect what mattered most. That made them predictable, and predictable enemies could be destroyed. She called a meeting with Jake Morrison and the coalition commanders. They spread out a map of Xanthari space and looked at the heart of the empire. Xanthar Prime, the throne world, the capital where the High Command ruled from. Jake studied the map, and his voice was quiet when he spoke. He said that humanity had been fighting for 17 years, and they had won battles, and they had hurt the Xanthari. But hurting them was not enough. He remembered Earth burning, and he remembered the transmission from Admiral Cole telling them that 8 billion people were dead. He remembered his daughter's last message about the sky being on fire. Hurting the Xanthari would never be enough. They needed to end them completely. Nicole Barnes looked at the assembled commanders, and she saw species that had all lost something to the Xanthari. She saw rage and pain and determination. She asked them a simple question. Are you ready to finish this? Every commander agreed. They would take the war to Xanthar Prime itself. They would siege the throne world, and they would tear down the High Command. The Xanthari had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years. That reign would end. The Coalition fleet gathered at the edge of Xanthari space in early 2266. Over 15,000 ships from 47 species assembled in formations that stretched across millions of kilometers. It was the largest military force in recorded galactic history, and every vessel carried crew members who had suffered under Xanthari rule. Admiral Nicole Barnes stood on the bridge of the CSS Retribution, humanity's new flagship built from salvaged Xanthari technology and human innovation. Around her, the bridge crew worked in focused silence. They were all survivors of Earth or children of survivors, and they had waited their entire lives for this moment. The jump to Xanthar Prime took 6 hours because the fleet was so massive. When they dropped out of hyperspace, the Xanthari homeworld appeared before them like a blue jewel surrounded by metal. Hundreds of defense stations orbited the planet and thousands of warships formed protective rings. The Xanthari had pulled back everything they had to protect their capital. High Commander Veskara had turned Xanthar Prime into the most heavily defended location in the galaxy. He believed no force could break through. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Nicole received a transmission request from the Xanthari High Command. She nodded to her communications officer, a woman named Claire Watson who had been born on Mars 2 years after Earth burned. Claire opened the channel and High Commander Veskara's face appeared on the main screen. His 3 eyes showed something humans had never seen from a Xanthari before: fear. His voice was shaking when he spoke. He said the Xanthari Empire acknowledged defeat and offered full surrender. He said they would withdraw from all occupied territories and pay reparations. He said they would accept any terms. He begged for a response. Claire looked at Admiral Barnes and waited for orders. The bridge was completely silent. Every person there was thinking about Earth. They were thinking about 8 billion people who never got a chance to surrender. They were thinking about cities that burned while the Xanthari ignored all pleas for mercy. They were thinking about families torn apart and children who died screaming. Nicole looked at Veskara's face on the screen and she thought about her parents and her brother and her nephews. She thought about the message Admiral Cole had sent 17 years ago, telling them to make the Xanthari pay. She made her decision. Nicole told Claire to close the channel without responding. Then she gave the order that everyone had been waiting for. All ships advance and engage. The Coalition fleet moved forward like a wave of fire. The Xanthari defenders fought desperately, and their tactics were solid and their weapons were powerful. But they were fighting an enemy that had been forged in the burning of an entire world. The Coalition forces hit the defensive lines with everything they had. Dreknir warships smashed through Xanthari formations using their heavy armor. Human vessels deployed waves of cascade torpedoes that turned Xanthari shields into weapons against them. Solian telepaths coordinated attacks across the entire battlefield with perfect timing. The battle lasted for 3 days. The space around Xanthar Prime became a graveyard of burning ships and debris. Both sides lost thousands of vessels. Captain Ryan Hughes died on the 2nd day when his destroyer took a direct hit from a Xanthari battle station. Lieutenant Amy Foster led a boarding action against a Xanthari dreadnought and cleared it deck by deck until the surviving crew surrendered. Kyle Patterson's experimental ships with phantom drives slipped through the chaos and destroyed command and control stations. The fighting was brutal and close, and neither side gave any ground. On the 3rd day, the Xanthari defensive lines finally broke. The Coalition fleet pushed through to orbit and began targeting the defense stations. One by one, the massive installations exploded or went dark. Jake Morrison led Phantom Corps in the ground assault. They dropped onto Xanthar Prime in armored pods and fought their way through the capital city. The Xanthari military tried to stop them, but the defenders were demoralized and scared. They had never fought on their own homeworld before. They did not know how to handle an enemy that showed no mercy and took no prisoners. The Xanthari civilians fled through the streets as the Coalition forces advanced. Some tried to fight and some begged for mercy and some just ran. Jake's team moved through the city toward the High Command Center. They encountered resistance at every block and the fighting was house to house and brutal. Phantom Corps soldiers who had trained for 17 years showed the Xanthari what real urban warfare looked like. They used every dirty trick and every vicious tactic that Jake had taught them. The Xanthari soldiers broke and ran. The High Command Center was a massive building in the heart of the capital. It was designed to withstand orbital bombardment and had internal defense systems that could hold off an army. Phantom Corps breached it in 4 hours. They cut through the walls and disabled the defenses and fought their way up level by level. The Xanthari guards made a final stand in the throne room where the High Command met. There were 50 guards armed with the best weapons the Empire could provide. They died defending their leaders because that was their duty, but duty meant nothing against soldiers who had lost everything. Jake Morrison found High Commander Veskara in the throne room. The Xanthari leader was surrounded by his dead guards and he was alone. His uniform was torn and one of his arms was broken. He looked at Jake with those 3 eyes and spoke in broken human language. He said they had surrendered and he said humanity valued honor. He said they had won the war and he begged for mercy. Jake stood there with his rifle pointed at Veskara's head and he thought about mercy. He thought about his wife Lisa, who had been a doctor and had spent her life saving people. He thought about his daughter Emma, who had loved animals and wanted to be a veterinarian. He thought about how they had died when the Xanthari burned Earth. Jake's voice was soft when he finally spoke. He told Veskara that mercy was for those who showed it to others. He said the Xanthari had not asked Earth for surrender and had not offered terms. They had just burned everything. He said humanity was going to return the favor. Then he pulled the trigger. Veskara fell and Jake felt nothing, not satisfaction and not guilt and not relief, just emptiness. The rest of the High Command was executed over the next few hours. Every member who had voted to burn Earth was found and killed. The executions were broadcast across every channel to every world in the galaxy. The message was clear. The age of Xanthari dominance was over. In the weeks that followed, the Coalition dismantled what remained of the Xanthari Empire. Their fleets were confiscated or destroyed. Their colonies were freed. The Xanthari themselves were confined to their home world, with their military dissolved and their power broken forever. Some Coalition members questioned whether the terms were too harsh. Ambassador Lydia Grant spoke at the final council meeting and her voice was tired. She said the Xanthari had come to Earth and committed genocide without hesitation. She said humanity had given them something the Xanthari never gave Earth, the chance to survive. She said that was more mercy than they deserved. The council voted and the term stood. The Xanthari would live, but they would never again threaten another species. Admiral Nicole Barnes stood on the observation deck of the Retribution as the fleet prepared to return to what remained of human space. She watched Xanthar Prime below and she felt hollow. They had won the war and destroyed an empire that had stood for 3,000 years. But 8 billion people were still dead. Earth was still a tomb. Her parents and brother and nephews would never come back. All the victory in the galaxy could not change that. Her first officer, a man named Eric Shaw, who had been born on Sanctuary Point after the burning, approached her carefully. He said quietly that they had won. Nicole shook her head. She said they had survived. She said there was a difference. Eric did not understand, but Nicole did not expect him to. He had never seen Earth. He had grown up in the war and knew nothing else. For him, this victory meant everything. For Nicole, it meant she could finally rest. But rest felt wrong when so many were dead. Jake Morrison resigned from Phantom Corps the day after Veskara's execution. He took a small shuttle and flew to the coordinates where Earth had been. The planet was still there, technically. It was a dead rock now with no atmosphere and no water and no life. The cities were glass craters and the forests were ash and the oceans were gone. Jake sat in his shuttle looking at the tomb of his homeworld. He had spent 17 years fighting and killing and destroying. He had led thousands of soldiers and planned hundreds of operations. He had made the Xanthari pay for what they did. He spoke to the ghosts, to his wife and daughter and the billions of others. He told them it was over and the Xanthari had been defeated. He told them he hoped it was enough. He hoped they could rest now. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Vengeance had been necessary and justice had been served. But it did not bring anyone back. 5 billion people had died on Earth and 3 billion more had died when the atmosphere burned away. All the battles and all the victories could not change that simple fact. Jake turned his shuttle away from Earth and headed back toward the living. The war was over, but humanity would carry its scars forever. An entire generation had grown up knowing only combat and rage. They had burned down an empire in the name.